There are stories the world forgets, not by accident but by design. Stories too heavy to carry, too sharp to hold onto. So they are buried layer by layer until even the memories of them feel dangerous. I have carried one of those stories, not because I wanted to, because once you stand too close to certain truths, they don't let go. This one begins in the spaces no one talks about, in the low rooms, the high towers, the thin sliver of night where power wears its real face. It begins with a man who wasn't supposed to listen, a recording that wasn't supposed to exist, and a secret that was never meant to leave the room. Didn't die by chance, he didn't die in a feud or because the streets caught up to him. He died because he saw too much, because he heard too much. Because he captured something the world was never meant to hear, and tried to carry it out alive. Most people never knew what he took with him that night, most still don't. But I know because I was there, and what I saw never really left. The house perched on the hillside like a thing waiting to pounce. All glass, sharp edges, and hollow silence. From a distance, it glittered under the night sky, a beacon of wealth and power, but up close, it was colder, less inviting. It was a place built not for living, but for watching. The lights burned too bright inside, cutting clean lines across the marble floors, but the corners stayed dark, as if the shadows had decided they belonged there and no one dared ask them to leave. The music was low and slow, not loud enough to fill the space, just enough to settle into the cracks between the conversations, thick and heavy like a second atmosphere. The people moved carefully, not drunk, not clumsy, but deliberate, every gesture small and rehearsed, every laugh thin and sharp-edged, the kind of sound that leaves a mark if you get too close. There was no joy there, no real celebration. Only ritual, the practiced rhythms of men who understood that power doesn't roar, it whispers. And in the middle of it all stood, not blending in, not trying to. He carried himself like a man who had been living too close to the fire for too long, sharp, restless. The tension in his shoulders so tightly wound it looked like it might snap if the wrong word was said. He moved through the crowd like a storm contained in a bottle, energy coiled tight, shoulders squared against something unseen. There was an edge to him that night, something more than the usual wariness of a man used to living on the knife's edge. His eyes, restless and sharp, scanned the room with a look that wasn't fear but something far more dangerous, anticipation. He wore a black shirt, simple, unadorned, but under the lights it caught a sheen like oil slick on water. His hands twitched at his sides, not from nerves, but like he was resisting the urge to reach for something, maybe a weapon, maybe a way out. I stayed to the edges of the room, where the music softened to a dull roar and the faces around me blurred. That's where the real things happened, in the shadows. That's where you saw people slip from their masks into their real faces. And what I saw that night, what I felt, was something colder than fear. It was recognition. Recognition that we weren't supposed to see what we were seeing. Moved like a man who already knew the script but hated the ending. He shook hands, he smiled, but every movement was measured, heavy with restraint, as if he could feel the noose tightening and chose not to struggle. His eyes barely flickered when he slipped his hand into his jacket and pulled out a recorder, small and battered, the kind sold for cash in nameless electronic stores. He clicked it on without ceremony, without hesitation, and tucked it away against his chest. The air shifted. It wasn't a gust or a draft. It was the kind of shift you feel in your gut, a pressure drop, the instinct that makes animals run before the storm hits. And across the room, a man I didn't recognize, tall, skeletal, skin stretched too tightly across his face, turned and met's gaze. His smile was thin, humorless, a slit in his waxen face. It wasn't a warning, it was a welcome. And for just a second returned it, not with friendliness, but with grim acceptance. Like he knew the rules of the game and chose to play anyway. The night crawled on. Time lost shape, the hours bleeding into one another, and the walls, those gleaming glass walls, seemed to creep closer, trapping us all in a transparent cage. The music slowed, warped, as if the record player was melting under invisible heat. Conversations frayed at the edges, voices dropping into whispers, then falling away entirely. Somewhere in the haze, I swear I saw a door open where there hadn't been one before. Just a sliver, just enough to glimpse something beyond it, something that looked back. I wanted to leave. Every part of me screamed to leave. But I didn't. Maybe the same thing that kept me, curiosity, pride, or maybe the understanding that once you see behind the curtain, it's already too late to pretend you didn't. I didn't speak to him that night. I should have, but something in his face told me he didn't want saving, wasn't looking for a way out. He was recording the end, documenting it in the only way he knew how, by bearing witness. I watched him slip out of the room, silent and unseen, the recorder still hidden, the weight of what he captured heavier than any weapon he could have carried. The glass door whispered shut behind him, and with it, the room seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into something that felt disturbingly close to satisfaction. Carried more than a secret out of that house. He carried a death sentence. And somewhere in the smoke and the shifting walls, the house, the people, the shadows. They knew it too. I stayed until the house emptied, until the laughter rotted away into silence and the air turned heavy, thick with the kind of smoke and sweat that clings to skin long after you leave. Nobody spoke about once he was gone. The guests melted into the night, their faces folding back into the dark, their names left behind like forgotten coats. But even without words, the memory of him hung in the room, dense and sharp, the way the scent of something burning lingers long after the fire's been put out. I didn't follow him, but I knew where he'd go, where any man would go after slipping too close to the edge. Later alone, sat in his car, engine off, streetlight above him stuttering, casting shadows that jerked and shivered across the cracked pavement. The night pressed in tight against the windows, as if it wanted in, and maybe he was too tired to hold it back anymore. When he pressed play, it wasn't music that answered. It wasn't the clink of glasses or the brittle laughter stitched together by too much champagne. It was something else, lower, heavier, a sound you didn't so much hear as feel. It slid beneath the ribs, into the spaces between the heartbeats, wrapping itself around the quiet places a man keeps hidden even from himself. At first, the tape sounded harmless enough. Murmurs, footsteps, the dull throb of bass. But slowly, as if peeling back a layer of skin, the background noise unraveled. The clinking glasses faded. The laughter soured, stretched, pulled apart like something decaying in fast motion. And underneath, woven so tightly you almost didn't notice it at first, there was another sound. A scrape, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floorboards where no footsteps moved. And threading through it, low and steady, were voices, not loud, not urgent, but close, too close, as if they were leaning in, whispering against the back of the neck. The language they spoke wasn't one I recognized, but it didn't need to be. Some things are understood without translation, the rhythm of something old, something cold, something that is remembered when men still feared the dark for what it truly was. The tape didn't just record the party. It recorded what the party was hiding, the thing lurking behind the bright lights and crystal glasses, smiling through borrowed faces, waiting for the music to die so it could finally be heard. He sat there with the recording hissing into his ears, long after the voices bled into static, long after the static dissolved into silence. He sat there as if the tape hadn't ended at all, but was still unwinding itself inside him, leaving its residue in his blood, its weight in his chest. He didn't rewind it, didn't play it again. There are some things you only need to hear once. I wasn't in the car with him, but after that night, I didn't have to be. You could see it, the way he carried himself, as if gravity had shifted just for him, pulling harder, dragging at his bones. The way the shadows seemed to stick to him a little longer than they should. The way the silence around him thickened until it felt like even speaking his name out loud might break something fragile and terrible. And if you stood close enough to hear the breath catch in his throat, close enough to feel the cold seeping from his skin, you could almost make it out. That same scrape, that same whisper, still trailing after him, patient as a shadow, familiar as regret. There's a way the world turns on you when you've carried too much for too long, but it never happens all at once. It happens in pieces, slow, quiet, deliberate, like the ground crumbling under your feet, one handful at a time. Didn't run, he didn't hide. He moved through the days that followed with the same restless certainty he carried everywhere. But something was different now. Something that weighed down his steps and stretched the spaces between his words. He didn't abandon the studio or the city or the faces he used to trust. He stayed exactly where he was, but it was the world that shifted around him. The streets he once knew folded away, grew quieter, the usual chaos thinning into something muted and unnatural. Familiar places felt hollow, emptied of their weight, the colors stripped out until everything looked washed and brittle under the sun. The city didn't breathe the way it used to, it held its breath. I saw it clear as anything. How people pulled away from him. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a sort of instinctual withdrawal. Like animals skittering from a scent they don't understand but know enough to fear. Friends turned into strangers with small, unspoken gestures. A shift of the eyes, a step backward. A conversation cut shorter than it should have been. Phone calls started to drop into silence, not from technical faults, but from something heavier, something that pressed down on the lines and smothered them, leaving only static where there used to be laughter. Noticed it, though he never said anything. He moved slower, spoke less, but there was no panic in him, no flailing. He carried it all in the set of his shoulders, in the slight bend of his back, as if he was bearing something no one else could see, something no one else wanted to. I followed him sometimes, not closely, not so he'd notice, just enough to watch the way the world peeled away from him. The way the air seemed heavier when he passed, as if it thickened around him and bent the light just slightly off. The way heat rises off asphalt in the summer and makes the horizon ripple. Shadows linger longer around his feet. Streetlights flickered when he passed beneath them. Conversations faltered and died when he stepped into a room. He went about his days, pretending at normalcy, picking up routines like a man putting on a suit he knows no longer fits. Studio sessions where the music wouldn't come. Meetings where the words got stuck in his throat. Familiar faces turning unfamiliar the second he tried to speak to them. Nothing stayed, nothing held. It wasn't that he was being hunted, not in any way that could be seen. It was worse than that. He was being shed by the world itself, unhooked from it piece by piece, the way a body sheds blood it can't use anymore. And he accepted it the way a man accepts the pull of the ocean when the current's too strong to fight. Not with anger, not even with fear, but with a kind of bone-deep resignation, the understanding that some tides aren't meant to be turned back. The last time I saw him, he was standing alone at the edge of a street I'd walked 100 times, a place that used to bustle and choke with noise but now sat silent and still under the weight of the setting sun. He didn't move when I approached, didn't speak. Just stood there, hands buried deep in his pockets, head bowed slightly as if listening for something far away. The light stretched his shadow thin across the pavement, but it wasn't the shadow that held my eye. It was the way the world around him blurred, softened, as if refusing to hold him in focus any longer. I wanted to call out to break the silence that wrapped around us like heavy cloth, but the words caught, dried up in my throat before they ever found shape. Some distances aren't meant to be crossed. Some endings don't come with a scream or a fight. They come with a quiet folding in, a soft erasure. I watched him for a long time that evening, until the sun slipped down and the streetlights shuddered to life, buzzing low and uncertain. I watched until he finally turned, walking away not like a man fleeing, not even like a man surrendering, but like a man finishing something he'd started long before the rest of us had even noticed. And I stayed there, standing still in the thickening dark, the weight of the moment settling heavy in my chest, knowing deep down that whatever road he had stepped onto that night, it was one no one could follow him down. Not even if they tried. Before a bone breaks, there's a moment, a fraction of a second, where the pressure builds and the body knows what's coming but can't stop it. The night felt like that. Tight, fragile, ready to split wide open the moment someone pressed too hard. The city breathed slow and heavy under the weight of it. The streets stretched thin under a sky too low and close. The air stifling, thick with the kind of heat that turns skin slick and makes metal smell sharp and bitter. Even the neon lights seemed to lose their fight against the dark, flickering low and unsteady, bleeding pale color onto the cracked sidewalks where the shadows crouched low and mean. Moved through it all with the same deliberate stillness he had carried for days, not running, not hiding, but walking as if the ground beneath him had already begun to give way, and he was simply riding it down, step by slow step. His shoulders were set heavy, and his face, that face that had once held whole rooms, whole cities in its orbit, had hollowed into something sharper, quieter, worn thin by whatever waited beyond the night. I stayed close enough to see the tension knotting in the spaces between moments, close enough to feel the way the world leaned in, heavy and expectant, as if it too knew what was about to happen but had decided not to interfere. The streets weren't empty. No, there was still movement, still noise, but it all seemed distant, flattened, as if I was standing behind glass, watching a version of the world that no longer quite included us. When it didn't happen fast. It happened exactly the way a crack splinters across glass, sudden but inevitable, a break that had been waiting to happen long before anyone noticed. The car slid out of the traffic, smooth and unhurried, the way predators move when there's no need to rush. No squeal of tires, no angry engine rev, just the low glide of steel against pavement, a dark mouth opening slowly, patiently around its prey. The window rolled down, a clean, deliberate motion, no panic in it, no hurry, and from inside came the glint of something cold and mechanical, a promise written in metal. The shots came sharp and tight, not a burst, not a storm, but a controlled tearing, a rhythm meant to end things. The air buckled under the force of it, the night itself seemed to recoil, and's body jerked once, a sudden, brutal pull inward, the way cloth collapsed under fire. No cries, no scrambling, just that one hard jolt, and then he folded against the open car door. Blood blooming in thick, dark spills across the metal, the weight of him sliding slow and final onto the seat. The smell was immediate: burnt powder, hot rubber, something else underneath. Something wetter and sharper that filled the lungs and sat heavy at the back of the throat. The headlights blurred in my eyes. The noise of the street fell away, and all that remained was the soft, irregular tapping of leaking fluids hitting the asphalt, the low, broken sigh of the night settling into itself. The car that delivered the shots didn't peel away in some frantic escape. It drifted back into the flow of traffic like a shadow slipping into deeper darkness, the faces inside unseen, untouched, unhurried. And he didn't move. The breath that had once shaken stadiums, once carried anger and fire and life, now came in shallow, stuttering gasps, and his eyes, wide and glassy, caught the light in a way that made him look less like a man and more like a photograph, a memory already fraying at the edges. The city around us didn't rush to intervene. No one screamed. No one ran. The world simply folded back, folded away, as if making room for the end of something it had already decided wasn't going to last much longer. When the paramedics arrived, they moved fast, but even from where I stood I could see it in the way their shoulders drooped, the way their hands moved, quick but hollow, the practiced rush of people who have learned how to fight battles they know they've already lost. I watched as they lifted him, as they pressed gloved hands against wounds that wouldn't close, as they loaded what was left of him into the back of the ambulance. The doors swung shut with a thud that was less a noise and more a punctuation. Not a shout, not even a whisper, just a full stop. The siren that followed was thin and sharp, peeling out into the night, but it sounded more like retreat than rescue, a cry from something already too late to matter. And me, I stood there, breath caught somewhere deep, staring at the blood drying black on the pavement, staring at the spot where had been and wasn't anymore, and listening to the silence rush back in, thick and full, as if the world had decided that was enough noise for one man's life. There is a kind of silence that settles after the violence ends, thick, reluctant, not from peace, but from the weight of things left unfinished. And if you know how to listen, it hums low, steady, patient, the way a wound hums when it refuses to close. In the days that followed, the city did what it always does. It moved on, washing the blood from the streets, pulling the headlines down from the front pages, folding the grief into smaller, neater shapes until it could be tucked away and forgotten. Faces flashed across television screens. Voices cracked and shook with anger, with sorrow, but even the loudest mourning sounds hollow. The kind of noise people make when they know they're too late but haven't yet figured out how to accept it. And under all of it, under the candlelight vigils and the crumpled flowers and the endless cycles of blame, there was something else, something quieter, heavier, harder to name. The tape. The one had carried with him that night. The one he had tucked away like a secret, like a weapon. The one nobody could find once the dust settled. It wasn't spoken about openly, not in interviews, not in the papers, but if you listened closely, if you leaned into the spaces between the words, you could hear it. The slip of a rumor passed too quickly. The careful glances traded between men who knew better than to say anything at all. The heavy pauses, the unfinished sentences, the way certain questions never seemed to get answers. Some believed it had been destroyed in the chaos, that it had been swept up with the blood and the broken glass, lost to the gutters or the flames or the quiet hands of men who knew exactly what was on it and how dangerous it could be. Others swore it had survived, tucked away somewhere unseen, passed hand to hand in the deep dark, kept safe or kept hidden, depending on who you chose to believe. But most didn't say anything. Most pretended there had never been a tape at all. as if denying it could erase the damage it had already done. The kind of willful forgetting people cling to when the truth has sharp teeth and long shadows. I never saw the tape, I never held it. But in the weeks and months after his death, I could feel it moving through the city the way you feel the shift in the air before a storm breaks, invisible but undeniable. It pressed against the streets, against the walls, against the thin spaces between memory and forgetting, a weight that grew heavier with every passing day. It was more than a recording, it had become something else. A wound, a mirror, a debt that no one wanted to pay. It carried the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had captured, everything he had refused to forget, and whether it still existed or not didn't seem to matter. It was alive now, buried not in drawers or safes, but in the thick, uneasy silence that follows when something dangerous goes unpunished. The tape was a shadow without a source, a whisper without a voice, a memory that refused to die quietly, and in the back rooms and closed offices and dark corners where power huddles close and afraid, it waited in the hollow places. It waited in the unfinished business left bleeding across the pavement. It waited in the silence that stretched longer than the morning, heavier than the grief, thicker than the lies. Some debts don't get forgiven, some ghosts don't stay buried. And the tape, if it was still out there, if it still breathed, wasn't done yet. After the last gunshot faded and the sirens pulled away into the bruised edges of the city, there was no grand reckoning, no avalanche of truth waiting to break free from the silence. There was only the slow, steady machine of the world shifting gears, smoothing the blood out of the cracks, folding the grief into something palatable, manageable, marketable. The streets carried the weight of mourning for a while, heavy with flowers and candle wax, with songs bleeding from radios, with faces turned toward the sky as if waiting for a sign that wouldn't come. But sorrow, like everything else here, has an expiration date, and it wasn't long before the world learned how to tuck the pain into quieter corners, leaving only the surface tidy and undisturbed, the way a wound is dressed but not cleaned. Behind the polished doors and the heavy glass where the real power sits, the response was quieter still, less public, more practiced. No outrage, just the mechanical hum of an industry that had learned long ago that grief is a currency, and tragedy, when packaged carefully enough, becomes just another form of profit. There were no statements of defiance, no desperate hunts for justice, only the silent, mutual understanding of men who had spent their lives smoothing down sharp edges, excising the dangerous parts of the story before they could cut too deeply. Diddy stood among them, though you wouldn't have found his name written across the headlines in the same breath as suspicion. He wasn't a shadow lurking in the corners. He was the center, the face the machine was willing to show, the smile framed by flashing cameras, the voice carefully modulated to sound human, broken, appropriately wounded. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested surprise, and nothing in his words that suggested a desire for the kind of truth that leaves a man's hands stained when it's finally dragged out into the light. He spoke, of course, you had to keep the machine running smoothly, but his words were the kind that curled back on themselves, polished to the point of meaninglessness, designed not to reveal but to suffocate, to bury the questions before they had the chance to be asked out loud. He stood in the spotlight, and the spotlight softened him, erased the harder lines, the uncomfortable connections, the memories of other rooms, other faces, other nights when the music played too loud and the contracts were signed with more than ink. The silence that followed wasn't born of fear. It was born of loyalty, of debts paid in favors and futures promised. of an understanding that some things are too valuable to sacrifice, even for the sake of the dead. Around Diddy, the walls closed, the rooms grew smaller, and the whispers that once might have threatened to rise up in anger or grief now folded in on themselves, dying quietly in the throats of men who had long ago learned the cost of speaking out of turn. The industry didn't just protect him. It needed him, needed the image, the myth, the idea that someone like him could emerge untouched from the wreckage, that the machine could continue turning without pause or consequence. Because Diddy wasn't just a man. He was a monument to survival in a world that consumes its own, a symbol that the game could be played, and one if you were willing to lose the right parts of yourself along the way. And he played it well, smiling where others flinched, moving where others stumbled, building a kingdom out of the bones of men who had dared to believe the game wasn't rigged against them from the start. You could see it if you knew where to look, the quiet retreats, the friendships that dissolved without explanation, the careers that withered in the spaces where questions used to be asked. The same old faces kept their seats at the table, sipping their drinks, signing their deals, while the smoke of what had been clung low and thick to the floor. A reminder that history, when written by the victors, tends to leave out the blood. Diddy's shadow stretched longer than most, reaching into places untouched by sunlight, curling into the corners of back rooms and quiet contracts. A reminder that the industry's real business isn't music or fame or even money, it's silence. Silence bought and sold and traded. Silence wrapped around truth like barbed wire. Silence polished and packaged and sold back to the world as success. The tape, if it still existed, was a threat not just to reputations, but to the very idea that the machine was clean, that the faces smiling from behind glass towers had gotten there by talent alone. It was a crack in the veneer, a reminder that beneath the wealth and the awards and the gleaming headlines, there were darker things buried, things with teeth and claws and old, familiar names. I watched from the edges as the world learned to smile again, as the songs played on, as the awards were handed out, as the dead were folded neatly into history, and the living stepped carefully over the memory of what had been lost. And I understood then, the way you understand things only once the noise dies down. That this wasn't a story about justice or truth or even revenge. It was a story about survival, about how men like Diddy learned to turn the weight of blood into gold, and how the industry, hungry and tireless, learned to call it a success. Some men leave behind legacies carved in stone, paraded in headlines and statues, names etched into memory by the sheer weight of their victories. Left behind something heavier, a warning not shouted, not printed, but woven into the spaces between the verses, stitched into the silence he carried like a second skin. He knew long before the bullets found him that survival wasn't just a matter of talent or strength or the weight of your name. He knew that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again, and that the things you see when you step through them stay with you, thick and clinging, no matter how far you run. He carried that knowledge with him, not like a shield, but like a wound, slow to heal and impossible to ignore. He wasn't naive. He understood that power has a price, that truth is a debt the world doesn't like to pay. Every song, every interview, every restless glance thrown over his shoulder spoke to a man who had already made peace with the fact that some battles can't be won, only recorded, only remembered. The night he slipped that recorder into his jacket, he wasn't just collecting evidence. He was leaving a mark, not for courts or headlines, but for those who would come after. Those who might be foolish enough to believe that the machine could be fought from the inside. And maybe that's why the tape mattered. Not because of what it captured, but because of what it refused to forget. Because forgetting is how the world heals its guilty conscience. Because forgetting is how the industry survives. But didn't forget. He didn't forgive, he recorded, he remembered. He left behind not a smoking gun, but a mirror, cracked and dirty, too uncomfortable to look into for long. And he knew that it was only a matter of time before someone tried to shatter it for good. I think about it sometimes, about that night, about the slow unraveling that led to the final, inevitable erasure. I think about the tape, whether it still breathes somewhere, locked away, forgotten but not dead. I think about the silence that followed, the way the world learned to hum along with it, and the way the names changed but the shadows stayed the same. And I wonder if knew all along that his death wasn't an ending, but a warning left hanging in the air, waiting for someone else to be foolish enough to listen, waiting for someone else to step into a story the world isn't ready to tell out loud. Because some legacies aren't meant to inspire, some are meant to haunt. And it haunts still. Stories like these aren't easy to tell. They aren't wrapped up neatly. They don't end with justice or clarity. They end the way. Did heavy, unfinished, full of questions no one is brave enough to answer. But the silence that follows is part of the story too. It's a silence that asks you, what do you believe happened that night? What truths are still buried beneath the noise, waiting for someone to listen? If's warning still lingers, if the tape still breathes somewhere in the dark, then maybe it's not too late to ask the right questions. To see past the headlines, to hear what the silence has been trying to say all along. Let us know what you think, what you believe. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready to hear more stories they don't want told, make sure you subscribe, because the silence might be louder than you think.